Please join me in welcoming to the stage Allan Blue.
Is the clicker to move through? Let's see if that actually works. Can I go backwards? All right. Hey, so good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to BSR for having me. I am pleased to be here, and especially considering your theme this year. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm not going to talk about the theater this morning. I do, however, want to make sure that we pick up on the theme of speed of technological change. And basically, what I would like to have this morning, if you're all willing, is a bit of a conversation, because I think the speed of technology change and the capabilities for business to make a difference in the world are going to call for a different balance and a different way for government and philanthropy and business to work together. And frankly, I don't quite know how to navigate that particular combination, building a new network for change in the world. So while I'm talking, if you can be thinking about how I might solve this problem, that'd be great, and then we can talk about it during the question and answers. So we founded LinkedIn in 2003. And when we started it, we had a very specific idea in mind. As Aaron mentioned, this is actually my third startup. My first startup was in 1997. And in 1997, it took us about 9 months of development and about 20 people and about $1.5 million to build our first startup. It was a dating service, actually. And but it did take us a while, but things were already starting to move fast then. And now we fast forward to LinkedIn in 2003. And it took us about 5 months and about 12 people and about $600,000 to build the first release of LinkedIn. And now, if you were to build something like LinkedIn, and certainly the Hack Day folks prove it, you can actually build something like LinkedIn now for probably $100,000, and probably 2 or 3 people could do it in a period of a few months. So we saw that change occurring. And that change in technology is actually not limited only to technology. It also applies to all of the industries that we're surrounded by on a daily basis. As a matter of fact, agriculture might be the first major beneficiary of massive technology change. In 1900, 40% of the US population was involved in agriculture. Now it's about 0.7%, and they produce substantially more output for that very small number of people. So it's a long story, that speed of change. So when we looked forward at LinkedIn, we decided that with more and more impact possible with smaller and smaller people, smaller number of groups of people, and smaller amounts of capital, we thought that the world of work was going to change. And what that meant was that we foresaw a time when individual professionals would become more powerful than their companies. We foresaw a time when small companies would spring into existence and then disappear overnight. We foresaw a time when larger companies would shrink to the point where they could focus solely on their core competencies. And we saw a gigantic blossoming of entrepreneurship, because there's so much possible for one person. And so when we founded LinkedIn, we had this idea that we needed to put the right tools in the hands of every person, every individual professional, so they could go out and live in that world of entrepreneurship. And so we created 2 things. The first thing we created was a professional profile, so a way to represent yourself in the large market and to everybody there, to attract opportunity to yourself. And of course, a worldwide network of professionals, because in the end, economies function via networks. So that's what we released in 2003. But the conversation that led to LinkedIn actually began long before that. In 1997, I met Reid Hoffman. So I hadn't known Reid at Stanford. We were actually classmates at Stanford, but we never met while we were actually there. So in 1997, we were introduced. We got together for Thai food one night, and we ended up talking for 4 hours. Anybody who knows Reid, and I know there are some people in the room who do, know that a 4-hour conversation with Reid is not a rare thing. One of the things we discussed has stuck with me ever since, and it is, he told me that basically economic change was the biggest lever that you could possibly pull if you wanted to make an impact in the world. And we talked about this for a while, and it's taken me a long time to really deeply internalize and understand it. If you want to make change in an individual community, the most important thing you can do is empower the individuals in that community with a little bit of economic freedom. If they have the ability to make choices, if they can get out of the business of supporting their families in a hand-to-mouth way, if they can begin to invest in their children's future, and the community around them, that's the thing which can form the basis for a peaceful society. It also means that people who are participating in an economy where they have economic consequences for themselves, basically they have something to lose. So they have a reason, basically, for a more stable and more secure place. So that was the first half, and obviously we didn't have anything to do with it, but the best example of it is like the Grameen Bank. So everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with the Grameen Bank. One of the really interesting outcomes for that was the change in voting behavior among Grameen's lendees. People who receive money from the Grameen Foundation vote at a much higher rate than people who, basically people who aren't participating in the microcredit economy. And the interesting thing is the way they vote. They basically choose stability in their political leadership and the ability to create more powerful economies. And this has been proved in Bangladesh election after election after election. So that's the impact in terms of why it works. The how it works is really interesting, and why the lever is so easy to pull. The most important thing is that because economies work like networks, when one person has economic power to actually share, it affects the entire world around them, and it grows on its own, which is an amazing thing. If I put power in the hands of one person, economic power, it becomes the property of the people right around them as they exchange services, as they exchange goods, and it flows out through an entire community. So the great thing about economic change is not just that it's powerful and effective, but also because it spreads through the network of people participating in the economy, it has a chance to basically spread virally through an entire country, through an entire region, or potentially through the entire world. So that was the conversation that Reid and I had in 1997, and that is also a foundational component behind the way we think about LinkedIn. When we talk about the vision for the company, when we talk about what LinkedIn is, we say in our vision statement, our vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, and that's 3.3 billion people worldwide. So it's very deep and close to our hearts. So there are obviously thousands of mission-driven companies out there, and I think that one of the things which certainly you saw in the hackers, and certainly we've seen in the rise of social entrepreneurism and a lot of the focus we see among younger generations. There's lots of people out there who believe that a social mission is central to the way they think about the way they think about what they're building. But one of the interesting things is we all believe that we who are social entrepreneurs, LinkedIn's not a social company, but we who believe we have a mission, just like we're going to go out there and do it. And basically, we're going to go out and write the rules. I mean, it's maybe a very Silicon Valley kind of attitude. The really interesting thing is, just recently, I've been able to see the equation from the other side. And it looks very different when you step into the shoes of someone in the government. So last year, in 2012, I met a group in Washington, they call themselves an action tank, as opposed to a think tank, and called the Hope Street Group. And the Hope Street Group is most famous for their contributions to Race to the Top, which is basically the effort to spread adoption of the Common Core curriculum across, basically across the entire country, all 50 states. And they've been deeply involved in that. I joined their board recently because I really appreciate the way in which they do their work. They basically take what they call an open source approach to making change. What they do is they bring together a bunch of interesting people who have interesting solutions, put them together into a room, try to come up with a solution, propose what they're going to do, and then actually execute it. And it's actually worked really, really well. Which is why I decided to join them. They invited LinkedIn to come out and talk about, hey, how would we close the skills gap in the United States? Right now, we've got millions of people who can't find work. We've got millions of jobs that are open where those people claim that basically they can't find people who have the skills necessary to do that job. How can we close that gap? So basically, we sat down. It wasn't just LinkedIn. It was several Valley companies, but also big employers, members of government. And it was an amazing conversation. That conversation has lasted, actually, the last year and a half. And I've been completely amazed by how strong, how passionate, how excited people are about the solution. Everybody wants to solve this problem. We basically came up with a solution which we think makes sense, and it comes back a little bit to the network theme. What we see is if you're going to close the skills gap, you've got three big actors. You've got job seekers, you've got employers, you've got educators. Each one of these three has a role to play in closing that gap. The job seeker obviously wants a job. The employer needs people who they can bring in to fill those jobs and people who they want to invest in for the future. And the educators are interested in great outcomes for the people who they help skill, who they teach, so that that person can go from their education directly into a job which leads to a career. So alignment of interest, right? But also, you can arrange it so there's actually alignment of function. So job seeker attempts to create, basically is looking for a job, either one that they're ready for now or they're almost ready for. Employer is looking for people who are ready for a job now or almost ready. And for those who are almost ready, they're looking for an education partner who can help them. And for the educator, they're looking for a mechanism to find employer partners who basically can help figure out a way they can work together to figure out a curriculum, which can help feed a pipeline of people into a particular company. That combination is actually a really, really powerful combination. And we've seen it work in small scale all around the world. And I've talked to governors. We had a meeting at the White House. It's been a busy time pursuing this. And we've heard from everybody how successful these things are in small scale. So the question is, how do you make it work at large scale? So we started going out. We started pitching. We talked to philanthropies. We talked, as I said, to government. We talked to other people in industry. And what we've heard from folks is that the folks in industry, they're all very excited about it. They all want to find a way to participate. But the interesting thing is that government is less interested in doing so. They kind of want government to run this particular structure. They basically say, well, this is something that we should be providing for the people in our locality, the people in our state, the people in our country. And philanthropies don't really know what to do because they're not really interested in investing things which have for-profit components in them. So we've talked lots of big foundations, all of whom are uncomfortable making that investment. So the question for me, and the question I would love to hear your thoughts on, is given that we have these big companies which have this amazing capability to work at scale, to make a big difference for people, and it's built into their missions or the way they think about their businesses that they will actually do so. How do we figure out how to build the right network between those companies and the educators and the government entities and the philanthropies so that we can magnify each other's efforts? For instance, right now, the US government, all in, and this includes federal, state, and local government, spends around $40 billion a year on workforce training programs. And that money is spread all throughout the system. And a lot of it is extremely low leverage money, where basically they aren't producing great results for people. If they had a solution which allowed them to see those results more effectively, This is nothing, whether it's LinkedIn or something else. Basically, that money could be way better spent. But the question is, how do you forge the relationship, which leads the government to say, yeah, basically, we want to be able to trust these companies to be able to make these, to be able to essentially allow us to have greater and greater leverage with the dollars that we actually spend, as an example. So, I would love to hear what you all have to say in your experience, because I would really like to solve this problem. Because to the question about the urgency of now, I think it's important that we begin making these changes today, not just to solve this kind of problem, but also to build a template that government and private enterprise can follow in the future in order to magnify our efforts to make the world a better place. So with that, I hope there are questions or comments about that. I'm also happy to talk about LinkedIn. So I'm not sure if how this works. Are there microphones or are there people just shout out? There are microphones. Fantastic. So there's a microphone right over there.
Hi, my name is Christina. I'm here with the Center for Responsible Business at the Haas School of Business, and wanted to tell you about a guest speaker who came recently to talk about innovation for social impact from Goldman Sachs. Her name's Alicia Glenn. You could look her up on LinkedIn. She's managing director of their Urban Investments Group, and I don't know enough yet about Hope Street Group, but they have developed some really interesting financial mechanisms to play in this space. So they've helped provide capital at unique phases within a network, for instance, to reduce recidivism rates. Am I being too loud?
No, I'm getting a pen.
Thought you were going to go. And then they've provided social impact bonds for early childhood education. And it's just, I haven't heard of any other banks that are playing in this space that basically have taken the time to pull various stakeholders together. And sometimes it takes a couple of years to figure out this process, but be happy to connect you with her.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I would love to do that. There's one back there. And as I said, I am also pleased to talk about LinkedIn or any questions you have around that. I know there are probably some, so feel free to mix those in.
Hi, my name is Sylvia Hassai. I'm with the Global Philanthropy Forum. I want to say from the outset, though, that this is a completely personal observation and question. I'm really interested in what you just said because I met with my kindergartner's teacher on Tuesday, and most of the conversation was, she's wonderful, she's top of the class. Let me tell you my worries about public education, though. And the fear, I mean, she's a great teacher. She's probably in her 60s, been around. She's taught in poor districts, taught in affluent communities. And I guess the crux of it is the erosion of the public good in some ways, that there seems to be a chipping away of a piece in our society that is not for profit, that is the public good, and there's a fear over what happens when it all becomes for profit. You know, she was saying these kids should never be for profit.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I have an answer, but that's certainly just another perspective, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about that because I think there needs to be some safeguards for the public good.
So I agree, and that's this is actually to me the crux of the problem. I believe that there must be a mechanism somewhere that can take advantage of all the things that the private sector is able to do in order to make the public good more possible. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to say that she said, to me, it's poverty. And there was an interesting piece I read recently that said it wasn't necessarily poverty, but that was her feeling. She's taught in really poor schools, and that's going to make the difference. And it may be the truth in many of these places that if you cannot mitigate against that factor, you're stuck.
So I agree about that, and as I mentioned when I was talking about it, I mean, creating economic change for people is the biggest lever that we think we could pull. So basically, if we could take folks who are unable to find a job, help them find a job, that changes a community if you can do it at scale. So, and I think that doesn't have an immediate impact in terms of It doesn't have an immediate impact in terms of the kids in that community, but it has a sort of secondary impact in terms of improving all the options around there. I mean, one of the really interesting things I have found in terms of making this kind of change is that as we were talking through the problem, we got ourselves all the way to the point where we were talking about very practical things about job seeking and so forth. But the really fascinating thing was, how do you make sure that the economic change turns into cultural change? Because the kind of change you're talking about, I think of as a cultural change. I think of it as something which values education and basically the universal access to it. One way to do that is by making economic change. That's an easier lever to pull, providing we can figure out a way to tie it to cultural change. And that's very much the approach that we'd like to take. There's some people down here. Thanks.
Hi, thanks a lot. Found your talk very interesting. So I also come from the tech world, and I think you identified a really interesting and confusing thing that I think frustrates a lot of people in Silicon Valley. I think I understand from what you're saying why nonprofits and philanthropies are hesitant to get on board. But government, like, why is it, what is it specifically that causes governments to not do things that are so clearly in the interest of their voters? I think like this, from the hacker mindset, like that, question. I'm wondering if someone who's had, sort of come from the tech side and has insight into that government process, if you can enlighten at least the tech people in the room. Maybe the rest of you are already aware.
Okay, so well, I'll give you this is my personal opinion. I think that so far, everyone I have met in government, every single person who I've talked to, whether they be at the national level, the state level, or the local level, has been passionately interested in driving value for their electorate and their voters and the people who they're representing, whether they're on the legislative side or whether they're on the administrative side. I just uniformly, everyone seems interested in doing it. I think there is and it's actually part of the way, I mean, this is national government, but it's also part of the way we're sort of set up, that in a lot of ways, government is intended to make sure we remain in the mediocre center. Meaning that it's important to make sure that you bring together all the views and bake that into something which can make a union which can hold together. And the same is true, I think, for any level of electorate. So in some ways, government is, by design, hamstrung in terms of its ability to take extreme measures, which is why I would love to figure out a way to have government take advantage of what social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship in general can bring. Because if we could figure out a way to do that, then government can continue to represent, and hopefully represent better and better over time. It's not so great right now, but hopefully it can improve. Represent better and better over time the needs of the populace, and then they can develop policy which takes advantage of what private enterprise is able to do. But never think that the people who work in government aren't there because they're passionate about what they're doing, because from my experience, they really are.
Allan, thanks for the insightful talk. I have a question about LinkedIn, if you don't mind,
Please,
now that you've been asking about that. Since I guess you're a little bit familiar with the company, the question is, how are you guys, the top leading network company, is leading the internal network or battle of pushing sustainability in your own company? Obviously, that goes beyond just a single email or just LinkedIn network. What are you guys doing? How are you leading the way inside in your own company? Because I guess that what you have as an answer is something that many of us might just replicate later.
Right. So I have some brief answers here. So there's a woman named Meg Garlinghouse. I don't know, some people here might know her. She now runs LinkedIn's what we call LinkedIn for Good, which is basically how LinkedIn as a corporation thinks about the way it needs to give back to its community. So it's not dissimilar in a lot of ways from the way that many corporations think about the way to better integrate with their communities. The interesting thing is that she actually has LinkedIn as a tool to leverage. So just a couple of things that she's been able to do. First, and we were talking about it beforehand. Basically, she shaped our product development so that our profiles now reflect volunteering in causes And basically, we've built a product on top of it called Board Connect, which is a mechanism by which LinkedIn can be used simply by nonprofits to find board members who would come join those nonprofits. Another one that we've done is basically we've augmented our profile once again and built some tools on top of it which allow it to become more useful for returning veterans. Because in a lot of ways, these folks are coming back and they need to enter the job market and they need special tools to be able to do it. It's an audit is of particular interest to us because the scale of it means that we can apply some of our big data techniques to actually solving some of those problems. We also have, just ramped up, we have a LinkedIn for Good Foundation, which will begin making external investments, but also internal investments. We have an internal grant program for individual employees who want to be able to do some good in their community or around the world. So basically, we give grants to people in very small amounts in some cases, and then tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to make a difference if they have a good plan that we want to invest in as a company. So that's sort of a short story about the way we think about our own local corporate responsibility. Right there? Or over here? Sorry.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Blue.
Morning.
So I'm Charmian Kinder. I work for a large media and entertainment company, and I actually have had the pleasure of sort of working in the nonprofit space when I first got out of college, and then I worked on a SED campaign in 2008, and now I'm on the for-profit side. And one thing that I think that might be innovative to do, and I was talking about this in a session, is to crowdsource a goal. So, for example, LinkedIn is looking at providing financial empowerment. So maybe the goal is to put, this is an ambitious goal, 1 million students through undergrad and business school, right? How do we get that accomplished? Now, I think the way that we all approach this is, well, how can we find the money, or like, specifically, what can we all do? The challenge with government is they take all of taxpayer dollars, so everybody has different views, and so we can't necessarily, or not we anymore, but you can't necessarily side with one side because the other side is going to be upset that you use their taxpayer dollars for a specific interest. So I think what you do is do the reverse, is have a goal, ask people who are passionate about this space, how can we do this? And literally use the power of social media to count it down. Maybe you're putting, 10 students through school a day or something until you actually physically get to that goal. Then you use government as your megaphone. I think we do it the other way where we pay a lot of media firms. But then you say, hey, government, we all did this together. This goal is accomplished. Let's talk about it. And then you get to those roundtables and different things where the entire nation sort of sees the great work that you've done.
Yep.
So I think that might be, I think we have a lot of barriers from the nonprofit side to the government side to the for-profit side because of all of our interests, or if we have boards, or if we have laws, or if there are different things that prevent us from working together. I think if we can find a space where it's very neutral and very natural for people to work together to accomplish a common goal, you can then go to government and tell them that they should talk about it.
Yeah, so I think that's great, and I think that's I know we can get at least that far. Are you familiar with with Donors Choose and with Crowdfunder and so forth? So there are actually a lot of platforms out there that are doing that, and those are places where LinkedIn's like, hey, maybe we should be working with one of these guys. The really interesting thing for me is how do we take it the next step after that? In other words, how do we get to the place where government's saying, yeah, these are good things to do, to, oh yeah, and we're going to take it so seriously that all the money we're putting, say, into Pell Grants, we put some amount of it into supporting this. Because in a lot of ways, we already have this massive collection mechanism, which is bringing together all these dollars. And if we could figure out a way for government to say, yeah, technology can help us direct to the right and most leverageable places, then maybe we could figure out a way to do it. I would love to figure out a way to cover that bridge. But I think you're totally right. It's a good place to start. It's back there.
Hi, I'm Rantau from Coca-Cola, and I don't have a lot of experience with PPPs. I'm sure that people in this room have more experience, but the little I do have is in China with government and private sector for wastewater treatment. In that specific scenario, there's that upfront capital cost, and if it's shared between government and private sector, it's beneficial. And then the private companies are just simply better. They're more efficient in operating the plants, so there's that trade-off. The one barrier is IP. So in China, it's notoriously a difficult environment. But in the case of this triangle, the IP that LinkedIn would theoretically develop for a social platform, it could be licensed to governments. I see that it's a great business development opportunity for LinkedIn, and as well as the educators and private companies. They have a stake to create their own workforce. And government, of course, if you're talking about a state and they have a jobs target, I don't see why they wouldn't want to invest in a package that you create. So from my naive point of view, and I'm sure other people here have much more experienced ideas about this, it seems that if the offering was constructed in such a way where those incentives were very clearly articulated for all of those constituents, it should be a pretty facile process. But why is it not the case?
So I think I think those things can happen. So one of the real challenges, and I think it's a great idea insofar as the technology is the core. But in the end, LinkedIn's value is really not in its technology. It's in the 260 million professionals who are in the network. So even if we said, here's the technology, the chances of a government, any government, being able to get to the place where they had a network of any size, it would be a very long road. Trust me, it was a long road to get to, I mean, it took us 10 years to get where we are right now. It's very hard to make that work. I would love, in the interest of time, to be able to apply the network that already exists to these problems. So figuring out a way, I think your idea is perfect when it's the technology that matters. But when it's the actual asset of the business that matters, meaning, in this case, our user base, I would love to figure out a way to work together more closely. But I agree with you otherwise. I think we have time for like one more question. There's some over here in the corner.
Morning. My name is Robin Kraft with World Resources Institute. You were talking about how a lot of young people want to work on things that they care about and that are going to change the world or at least have some sort of social good impact.
It's been our observation, yes.
Yeah, and I am totally into that as well. So my question is, how do companies or job roles that don't have necessarily a very clear and obvious like socially positive impact, whether it's I mean, for me, like, I'm not that into accounting, but like the accountants or something else, how do you get a young person who has that kind of role but wants to be making a positive social change? How do you sort of get them behind whatever the company is doing to LinkedIn's vision of helping everyone get a job?
So it's a great question. I think in the end, short answer to the question is that every great company out there that's trying to make a difference in the world needs accountants. But I think in the end, one of the reasons big networks work and one of the reasons economies work is that people inside are acting in their own self-interest. So if you can come up with a mechanism by which you're reaching your own personal goals, you're reaching your professional goals and goals for your family, and build alongside that the ability to reach these additional goals so that basically they can become part of the way you think about your career and like what your role is in the world, that's back to that question of cultural change. I think that's the best combination because it means you have the energy to make the system work because everyone's acting in their own interests. But in the action of that system, I come into contact with the responsibility I have for the rest of the world. So I saw this clock countdown. Are we done? Are we done?
Hello? Hello?
Oh, wait, sorry. One more question. Beautiful.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Gavin Bailey from Tesco. We're a large multinational retailer. And I just wondered if you could reflect on how you see LinkedIn being used by companies in their supply chains. So, one of the things we're doing, we've got our supply chain collaboration hub for all our suppliers. And so we're talking about sustainability, running webinars, talking about carbon reduction. And of course, LinkedIn is a far broader tool than that and can engage deeper into supply chain communities. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on tools.
So I think the answer is yes, but not right now. So we're not building something specifically to serve what I would say to be Company A collaborating with Company B, Company C, Company D around a certain project. When we think, the big story goes like this. In the end, LinkedIn is about two things. It's basically about making sure you're doing something you love and making sure you're great at doing it. So doing what you love is about finding the right job, about finding the right career, about the kind of cultural change we were just talking about, in other words, making sure you're doing something not only that you're interested in, but also that you're passionate about its outcome, okay? Being great at what you do means I have the right information, I have the right tools, or I have the right relationships in order to be really good at this particular thing. I think in the end, if we're actually going to get out there and serve every professional in the workforce, we're going to do it in part by helping those people do that work really effectively. So what that means is that supply chain is an inevitable component of LinkedIn's future. It's not a current component, so basically the use for that kind of thing is limited at this point. But as we become a more common platform for messaging and as we become a tool not just for recruiters but for other people to do their work, I think it's going to be uniquely valuable for people to do that. I think with that, we need to wrap up. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the suggestions.